Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this fortnight, it's Alastair's favourite time of year. It's prestigious Oscar bait movie time, and we'll be covering two of them in this very show. It's Robert Eggers' remake of Nosferatu, and also A Real Pain, the new movie written and directed and starring Jesse Eisenberg along with Kieran Culkin. But before these two heavy-hitting films, Alastair, what other big prestigious things have you seen?
Yes, well, as you said, I am trying to get through all the Oscar films. It's my favourite time of year. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in the cinema to see. As of recording, they announced the Oscar nominations 2 days ago, slightly delayed due to the Los Angeles fires. So, yeah, I've been going through the films, making a list of the ones I've seen and the ones I plan to see. Doing quite well so far, actually. By the time they were announced, I'd already seen 4 of the 10 Best Picture nominees, and considering one of them's not out yet, I feel that's pretty good going. I think we made a good call with Conclave, that we both put in our top films of 2024. That's been nominated for Best Picture.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so I still hope it wins.
Yeah. We'll see. It's an interesting list. So there's a few that we've covered on the podcast. Dune Part 2 as well.
I just looked up the list. A Real Pain didn't make it.
No, Real Pain is the big snub. We might come to this in the review. But I think the only nomination is Kieran Culkin as Best Supporting Actor. But yeah, nothing for Jesse Eisenberg in writing, directing, producing, acting, the whole shebang.
Harsh.
Is a bit of a snub. But what I've come specifically to recommend to you, other than the list of films in general, is, another of the Best Picture nominees, which is Nickel Boys, which is probably the sort of artiest, weirdest one on the list in that it's got quite a, novel approach, shall we say. It's a film that's set in America, in Florida, in the early 1960s, and it follows these two boys who were sent to a reform school where horrible abuse took place. It's a fictional story based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, but the novel's based on a similar school that really exists, and they use a lot of historic details from things that actually happened to tell this fictional story. It's got this interesting conceit of that the whole film is shot in first person from one of the two protagonists' point of view, apart from one shot in the middle of the film where it breaks the conceit. So what it is, it's you feel very much like everything you see, you feel the abuse happening to you, you very much are immersed in it with this kind of first person perspective that's used, which does make it a very harrowing, emotional, intense film.
Okay, so you say it's from this boy's perspective. Do you mean like Peep Show style strapped to his head?
Yeah, pretty much,
okay.
It is, reminiscent of Peep Show in that, I mean, Peep Show similarly was very good at taking you inside the minds and the perspectives of Mark and Jez by giving you everything from their perspective or someone else's perspective. It is like that similar approach. You don't get voiceover to hear their thoughts, but everything is from one of these two boys' point of view. And the first 20 minutes to half hour of the film is just from one of the characters' points of view, telling the story of his life and how he ends up in this reform school. And it's not until about half an hour into the film where he meets the other protagonist and you get a different perspective, and that's the first time you see the character whose eyes seeing through, you've seen what they look like from the outside only about half an hour into the film. So it's quite arty in that regard, but it does really work, I think, on making this feel very immersive, and I think bringing the literary style of the novel to life.
Oh, have you read the novel?
I have not, but that's just something I have cribbed from interviews with the director and reviews I read of the film.
As in the novel, presumably, is in tight first person.
I imagine, it's in tight first person and is very much about how the emotional impact of experiencing abuse. It's not an easy one to watch. It's quite upsetting and harrowing.
A first person movie about experiencing abuse. Yeah, I can see how that might be.
It's quite intense.
A rough one.
Yeah, I mean, it's only a 12A, so it's not really visceral. There's not lots of violence. We're not in kind of 12 years a slave territory where you see what it's like to someone getting whipped 15 times to see exactly how bad that is. But it's very, I guess, psychologically painful. I mean, because a lot of the things, a lot of the scenes of abuse, the person who's been hit or whatever closes their eyes and tries to tough it out, as people do in real life. So actually some of it's just a black screen with just the sound of something hitting flesh or things like that, or just someone mercilessly staring at a piece of wall trying to focus on that, which sounds kind of weird and arty, and it sort of is, but also it really does work because a lot of it is about the abuse not seen and hearing things and having them sort of in sideways glance at things in some ways can be more traumatic than actually seeing them directly. A lot of it is like the other pupils in the school things that they say and stuff about each other. Like there's one bit someone talks about a kid who was forced to eat a light bulb. You don't see that.
Oh, God.
You just hear about it, and
God.
it's quite obviously it's quite disturbing. Yeah, and there's various bits. I mean, part of the film is set in like the early aughts. The grown-up version of the main character, in the grown-up version played by Daveed Diggs from Hamilton and Clipping, researching the school when he's an adult, and as all the sort of things come out and they uncover things like mass graves on the school grounds. So yeah, there's quite a lot of really disturbing stuff, but it's always approached with a sort of skew angle, which kind of makes it in some ways even more disturbing.
Okay, so I guess we're not talking loads of banging naughty needle drops like in Saltburn.
No, it's not that sort of film. Most of the music from the film is from the period. There was quite a bit of early 60s jazz and things like that. It does do a really good job of evocatively conjuring the period and things like that. For example, there's lots of stuff very much in the background about the space race and things like that, and every so often there's it cuts to footage of things like rockets taking off and the American putting satellites in orbit. So yeah, they really locates the film very much in the early 60s, kind of making the point that these children are enduring medieval conditions, whereas at the same time there's these huge technological advancements going on in America. There's quite a lot of cultural references, including there's a lot of bits from the film The Defiant Ones from the early 1960s, because there's a bit when it's screened in the school. So yeah, I guess there are kind of cultural bits weaved in. Yeah, I guess kind of hint at the broader period it's set in. But again, it's done in a sort of slightly odd, slightly abstract sort of way.
So it's successful then, this film. It makes you feel the things that you think it wants you to feel.
Yeah, it's very successful. It's probably one of the hardest hitting of the Oscar films I've seen so far. Part of me feels it's just a bit too weird maybe, and a bit too visceral to win Best Picture. And also I don't know if America is really in the mood for enormous discourse about the abuse of African Americans right now, so maybe they'll go for something less politically contentious. But yeah, it is really, really effective. And I would strongly recommend this, but I guess with a caveat of it's not easy and it's not everyone's cup of tea. A lot of people might find it too upsetting to sit through. So, don't force yourself. It's going to be a traumatic experience. But what I do feel about how it works, and I'm taking this from a YouTuber who I watched discussing 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I can't remember the film YouTuber's name, which is really unfortunate. But he was talking about arty films or very abstract films, and they were saying that a lot of them, although can be very visually interesting and have creative ways of storytelling, you kind of need this core story to latch onto for most people to have an emotional connection with and things like that. And he drew out 2001, which has quite a simple story in it, considering it's quite a long film and the story's quite simple, but it does have this kind of core accessible story despite all the sort of strangeness of it. And I kind of feel the same applies to this film, in that there are a lot of abstract bits involving, there's lots of things involving archive footage, the space stuff I've talked about, other films, the whole first person thing. Some bits get quite abstract, through the more traumatic moments. But I think because it's got this quite simple but very impactful story of this kid who, through no fault of his own, ends up in this horrible reform school and has to survive. And you've also got this really visceral, you're in the head, you're kind of connected to these two characters. So I think all of that really anchors the film amongst all the weirdness, so it kind of really works together in that way. And as someone who sees a lot of quite abstract films at things like the London Film Festival, I kind of feel there is a lesson to have something to anchor you does really help, which is what this film has, and I think makes it a great success.
Okay, we may get to a similar point when we come to my review of Nosferatu, but anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, my plan to watch my way through the Oscar films is proceeding. I'm sure there'll be future updates in this segment. But Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, a brief break from the extremely worthy discussion of Oscar-nominated movies to drag us, into a slightly more populist zone, because I, along with a lot of the rest of Britain, have been watching the third series of BBC reality series The Traitors, which finished literally the night before we're recording this. So I have seen the whole third series. It's really reached a point where I just use them interchangeably and sometimes get confused mid-word which one I'm saying. So yeah, this third run, another group of hopefuls went into the castle. This season, it's really killing me, is probably a slightly more, I don't know, it felt a bit more fractious than previous series. It doesn't quite feel like we've got to the point where people are applying to this show because they want to be famous, and, it's, I don't know, for lack of a better term, whatever screening they have for this series is really doing a decent job of weeding out the reality TV psychopaths. The people who really are just going on there because they want to overact and be hysterical. They have so far managed to restrict it to people who come across as mostly quite well adjusted and normal, which is, I think, a big part of why this show is still watchable and good by season 3. Because yes, this has been another successful series for the Traitors, I think. It's had a few good turns and twists. There was some massive traitor-on-traitor betrayals towards the end, which is always one of the fun parts. Some memorable characters. There was an opera singer in her 70s called Linda, who was chosen as a traitor early on and seems to have become a national celebrity for her complete inability to subtly play a traitor and her determination to just aggressively overact. And at one point, when Claudia Winkleman made a general remark addressing the traitors out in public to everyone, she just sort of turned her head towards it as if someone had called her name and was then immediately called out on this by another player.
Yeah, even I've aware of this. Things like that have been sort of clipped and shared on social media a lot. So yeah, I guess that it adds to the gaiety of the nation, I'll say, when something like this happens.
Yeah, I've said this about the Traitors when I covered it last year, and I think the same still applies. It works for me as a watching experience because it seems to be mostly keeping itself in the lane of these are people playing a game. It's almost more a game show than a reality show, or the line is blurred, but it manages to avoid the more exploitative, unpleasant or tedious parts of most reality shows for the most part. There is usually a few bits once every episode or two where you are told about the people's sad backstories and maybe encouraged to have a little cry. But for the most part, it avoids feeling too manipulative and just like some people playing a really, really silly, melodramatic goth game show, which I'm able to enjoy.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the things that seems to have captured the nation's attention once again. It's interesting to see how long they can, keep this up, with it being one of the biggest, most talked about things when it's on TV, and it's real kind of cutting through society in that, everywhere from friends to work to my partner seems to be watching this show. And it is nice actually to have something that brings everyone together and something we can pretty much all agree on is entertaining. But I think especially by the later episodes, it did seem like the whole nation was hooked. Even I watched a bit of the ending of the penultimate episode with the seer, where one person can discover who's a traitor and then successfully manages to finger the one surviving traitor in the group, which was, pretty dramatic moment that I honestly can't believe wasn't scripted, because it kind of worked out perfectly. And they were best friends as well, or something like that.
Yeah, it's the way they go in hard on melodrama, like the way they really tried to play up this confrontation between the seer and this traitor they'd accidentally chosen. As if it was like a massive confrontation over dinner in a castle between like the hero and the villain. You have to admire the way they're really committing to this. It's really stupid, and it's really, I don't know, if anything, almost entertainingly undercut by the fact that these are also clearly just random British people who do not necessarily often lend themselves to these sort of soaring, po-faced gothic moments. For whatever reason, it works.
I guess because most people look at it and feel like, well, that's how I would behave in that situation.
Well,
I wouldn't. There's always that veneer of reality. Sometimes looking at this show, I always have this strong feeling that they've hired an editor whose background is like drama TV, because it is cut very much like a drama rather than like a reality TV show. They kind of, it has the sort of narrative progression, I feel, of fiction. And obviously, because that gives you the dramatic beats and emotional moments that you want to kind of engage with these people, I suppose. But also there's this veneer of reality in that you are getting someone's actual responses in the actual moment. And obviously, as pointed out, some of them aren't great actors or whatever, or like, performers are, or people performing in fiction is, but that gives you that veneer of reality that it kind of makes it entertaining, because you're always thinking like, what would I do if it was me?
Well, like there are occasions where people who are really quite bad at the acting are made traitors, and it's just a disaster, and that's, it doesn't necessarily lead to the biggest melodramatic gothic twists, but it's quite funny in its own way as well. There's something for everyone.
I guess there's a process of like the bad actors get weeded out early on, which adds some levity to the earlier seasons, but obviously through the process of attrition, the ones who are good at hiding and manipulating and betraying survive to the end, thus increasing the tension.
Yeah, and there were a few additional, twists and tweaks to the formula this year to amp it up or make it a bit different. Like they didn't do the seer thing you talked about. Yeah, it's another year of the Traitors, and in some ways it's hard to say much about it other than good job. This is the first year I've actually watched it as it aired in a fully engaged fashion, whereas last year I suddenly decided to follow the Traitors when there were about 3 episodes left and ended up being forever about 2 weeks behind. But it's been fun actually following it in real time this year. I even watched the Traitors Uncloaked after show thing where they interviewed the exiting players. So it's been fun to fully join in with this national pastime.
Is that the one with Ed Gamble from Off Menu on it?
That is the one.
Yeah. Always good to get that spin-off content in as well. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting how it's delivered, how it's done over about 3 weeks, but with 3 episodes a week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I feel that really like builds momentum in that, you don't have to wait long for your next installment of Treachery.
Well, yeah, but if you sit and contemplate an episode of The Traitors, like, not that many things actually happen in them. You could probably bullet out the list of things that actually take place in an episode of The Traitors, and it would not be very long, even by, like, modern Netflix TV standards. It's very much a certain amount of style over substance, and I think spitting them out quickly to get the momentum up counteracts that.
Yeah, and it does help it become something that gains momentum in like the media and the public discourse. And the fact that it's on in January and things like that, I think really helps in that. First of all, it's like the miserable grey post-Christmas part of the year when people are inside and looking for something that's crucially like free, but also, again, as I said, add to the gaiety of the nation. And also it feels very much like the first big kind of media event of the new year, this year 2025. So there's a sense of like, right, we're now into something new. This is like a thing that's happening now. We're over the sort of Christmas reflection and New Year lists of what happened last year. We're now into like the first things of 2025. So similar to when like what I like with this time of year when all the Oscar stuff comes out, it feels like, as well as being something I really like, it feels like the year is underway and we're moving forwards.
Yeah, now after the sort of weird slowdown you get over Christmas, it is nice to be sort of quickly moving forward into something exciting and new, even if it does now make it feel like January has just passed in a snap.
Next, this episode, we are discussing Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. Set in 1830s Germany, Thomas Hutter travels to Eastern Europe to do a property deal with the reclusive Count Olaf, while his wife, Ellen, suffers from horrible nightmares. Little does he know that Count Olaf has supernatural powers and designs on his wife. No prizes for guessing what those powers are and what fictional supernatural villain they relate to. We saw this film in the cinema recently. Nick, what did you make of it?
Yeah, it's a weird one. The film is well made, the film is atmospheric, the film is well acted. The film didn't massively suck me in or scare me. I'm glad the director got to do the homage he clearly very badly wanted to, and there's a lot of really good individual scenes, which are, as I say, well made, and some of which sort of work on their own terms. The debut scene of Count Orlok himself is very fun, as is the sort of general visual of him. But yeah, I must admit, the film as a whole, I don't know, lost me a bit as it went along. Maybe a bit of an interesting failure, or certainly a bit less than the sum of its parts for me, Nosferatu.
Yeah, what I like about Rob Eggers' films are the kind of detail and craft that he puts into like all the research that he does, and all the like specific period dialogue and things like that he weaves in. Like, he does create these very immersive films on these historical periods. His previous films like The Witch or The Lighthouse really are like full of like language of the time and kind of the jargon of being a lighthouse keeper and things like that, and it's all done very much straight up, like no irony, no nods to camera, no kind of acknowledging that this is kind of daft. It is just like, you're there and this is normal. And this film kind of has that. That's what I liked about it. Again, this kind of does feel like he's conjured like a whole world. I don't know if this film was a bit more mainstream, maybe aimed at trying to break a mainstream audience. His previous film, The Northman, was his supposedly going mainstream, taking a big studio budget, having more big stars in it. This one feels less like as weird as like The Lighthouse or The Witch. I feel this is a sort of thing where maybe one for the fans, one for the cinephiles to like, but just to kind of in terms of like trying to make, I don't know, a film for like a general audience, it's probably not worked in that regard. But I suppose for the fans, there are lots of like little like Eggers touches that are enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, have I seen all his films? I've seen The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman. Is that all of them?
I'm pretty sure that's all of them, unless there's like one that I've forgotten. But
yeah.
The Witch is definitely the first one.
Yeah.
It was nominated for a debut feature award.
And this is not to say it's rubbish, but I would definitely put Nosferatu at the bottom of that pile.
Yeah, me too. But then it's one of those things. It's like, he's only done a few films. I was trying to think of an analogy. He's only done a few films, and they're all pretty good. But yeah, this one is definitely my least favourite.
Yeah, it's praising with faint damn to an extent. It's not. I'm not saying it's a piece of shit. I'm just saying it's not as good as his previous films.
Yeah, which is very much the case. Yeah.
And yeah, as you say, there's a lot to like here if you're a fan of Eggers' general style, and in general these sort of little touches and atmosphere and this sort of gothic dramatic. Yes, again with the gothic. Again, yes, this is in many ways just like The Traitors.
It's a very goth winter we're having.
It's to the right time of year, and yeah, it is very into its vibe. If anything else, it's almost weird that the film seems so concerned with its vibe, and yet I didn't feel it that much. I don't know. There was a teenage girl behind us in the cinema who firstly seemed quite bored and fidgeting throughout the entire film, and then exclaims during the credits something like, "That was so boring, I wasn't scared at all." And, although I don't fundamentally approve of teenagers making noise in the cinema, I don't disagree. Well, at least about the part about not being scared.
Yeah, I feel the film is very much let down by the fact that it's clearly been packaged and sold as a straight up horror film, and it's also kind of been sold as a kind of, this film is so scary you'll shit yourself in the cinema sort of thing, which is really not the actual film you get. And I suppose it's not really the faults of audiences if they have totally unrealistic expectations from the film they're going into. This film is not particularly scary. It's got a couple of alright jump scares in it, but beyond that it's more about tone and mood. It's kind of more of a sort of gothic adventure than a horror movie, in that there's a kind of, there's a baddie, and then there's a bit halfway through the film when the main characters sort of assemble. There's Thomas, played by Nicholas Hoult, who's very good. There's Ellen, his wife, played by Lily Rose Depp. There's the couple that Ellen's been living with while he's away, and there's William Dafoe masterfully camping it up as this eccentric professor obsessed with the occult and things like that. And they kind of go on a bit of a sort of gothic adventure. There's a bit sort of 2/3 into the film when they outline the plan on how they're going to kill Nosferatu, and it pretty much could be like taken from the pages of a Marvel film or a Mission Impossible film, when they have the bit when they set out, right, this is the plan, we're going to go execute it. And it's got more of a just sort of adventure vibe to it. It's kind of odd in that regards, and I feel for audience members who, if you're not here for Eggers' style and you're just here for like horror, and what you want is like something really intensely scary, that's really not what you get, and it's also kind of what you were promised from all the marketing material.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of the bits I enjoyed most about this film, to be honest, were the parts where the visuals or the acting or the director, I guess, did something really silly and audacious that I just sort of had to laugh, the sort of really weird, massive stuff, like when you get your first few looks at Nosferatu, Count Orlok, with his massive moustache. It's like, okay, sure. Or the bit where Nicholas Holt's character first arrives in the village where Orlok lives, and they're all doing weird folk dances. Like, oh, absolutely, okay. That sort of weird off-the-wall stuff. But, I mean, firstly, there's not enough of that, to be honest. That sort of dries up. And secondly, I don't really know. That's not quite enough to sell a whole film.
The moustache is quite Dr. Robotnik, isn't it? It's kind of hard to take seriously.
I mean, I can't fault it if that's what they're doing. It's just really, I don't know. I didn't really feel like they went far enough in that direction. I mean, I don't know. I don't really want him to make a comedy, but it's too silly to be a serious adventure, but it also seems too preoccupied with being a serious adventure to really entertain me as a sort of audacious silliness. I mean, based on the finale, does it also want to be some sort of gothic erotic story? But it doesn't really commit to that either.
No, that is probably one of the issues here, that it is trying to be like lots of different things and being pulled in different directions. Again, I don't know if this is the studios trying to be like, for a big budget, we need to make something that fits into like a neat box that can be sold, rather than strange things, like the sort of weirdness that's kind of harder to sell. I mean, I think things like, again, the moustache, I'm sure, is probably like a period accurate facial hair that people would have had at the time, and the folk dancing bit in the small village is probably, knowing Eggers' commitment to research, as though that probably the sort of folk practices that went on at the time. It does successfully capture that feeling of, you're in a strange country, he's a traveller, he's a long way from home, he's quite isolated, everyone has different customs and language here, he's really on his own, and there's sort of risk associated. And Eggers is good at like throwing you into like a different world, like be it the New England Puritan settlers of The Witch, or the world of being a sort of, a sort of Victorian era lighthouse keeper in The Lighthouse. I mean, I guess we should stop continuing comparing this to his previous films, but I think I agree with what you're saying, and all those kind of weirdnesses were much more believable and immersive in his previous films. Like in The Lighthouse, it's kind of ridiculous that, the William Dafoe character says like, "Oh, ye wish you were a wiki," sort of thing, and like in The Witch, all the kind of thous and those, the way people talk is like, at first it's kind of ridiculous that, people talk like that, but then you kind of get immersed in it, and because it's just unironically doing the thing, like doing a character who would say ye rather than you, without it being a silly joke. Maybe this one doesn't go far enough because it's not an alien enough environment. Maybe the kind of the lives of the ordinary people, or the sort of ordinary middle class people of Germany in 1830s are too similar to ours to be kind of really alienating and weird and immersive. So all the fact that this is a world with actual fantastical creatures in it means that you know, it kind of shatters that sense of like, you've gone to like a different period in time. But whatever it is, it's not working.
Eggers' previous sort of horror-tinged films, The Lighthouse and The Witch,
Yeah.
both did a good job of sort of steadily escalating the darkness, the weirdness, the sense that something scary's going on, until it gets to this sort of peak massive explosion at the end of the film, and then it stops. And those films are actually scary. I mean, I still think The Witch is the best one, because I am one of those boring people who thinks they did their best work first. It's been downhill since then. But Nosferatu, it doesn't have quite that same steady escalation. I sort of wanted to get further into the heart of darkness, but if anything, the peak of darkness comes a bit earlier in the film, and as you say, the further we get into it, the more it becomes this sort of slightly more straightforward adventure.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Yeah, I do feel that like the kind of most immersive, weird and creepy stuff is like quite early on, you know, when Thomas visits the castle and like the whole build up to the castle, like say with the weird village and then the horse-drawn carriage ride up the hill and then the dark castle, and that bit is kind of more immersive. Most of the plot takes place in the town where he's from. It's those castle bits that are sort of more good and interesting.
Yeah, it was weird. When I was watching it, I was a bit sort of, oh, we've got to the vampire's castle and we're having the really, really creepy scenes with Nicholas Hoult meeting the vampire. And that stuff was actually quite creepy, to be fair. I was not exactly scared out of my mind, but I was, enjoyably unsettled by the scenes with Nicholas Hoult dealing with the vampire. So I was sort of, oh, okay, how are they going to one-up this? And the answer turned out to be that they're not, really.
Yeah, you're right. Those scenes are kind of perfect early horror movie scenes when they're like, okay, I'm a bit creeped out and I've this sort of vibe of like violence could happen at any moment or disturbing things could happen at any moment has been established. Okay, cool, good marks, and then it crests to that point and then subsides.
I mean, it's not total garbage after that, William Dafoe turns up and he's always fun in this sort of film.
Yeah.
Almost inevitable that he's going to turn up in this sort of thing. Lily Rose Depp does do a decent job of the acting. I do appreciate the vague satire of them getting freaked out and chaining her up because she's doing this sort of sexually tinged visions, and her orgasm faces make them uncomfortable. And I can see what he's doing. There's some decent satire in there.
Yeah, I think some of the film's more interesting bits are this kind of, what's it saying about female hysteria and sexuality. It's set in this, earlier even, I guess, pre-Victorian period where it's a very repressed and formal society and there's a lot's buttoned down. Ellen's sort of, the way she's free and open with her emotions, and she's also suffering these horrible visions, but it's all very sexual and things like that. And it's not the way women are supposed to behave, and it's not the way people in the society are supposed to behave. And it's clearly making points about, hysteria and women, their problems being treated as just women being silly, really. And there are, again, some quite gruesome bits, which I'm sure are period accurate of her, things like they try bloodletting to cure her and chain her up and things like that, and it is quite unpleasant. Yeah, and I feel that's where thematically the film's at its most interesting. But it's kind of very much, in the background, I suppose, for the horror perspective, it kind of again paints her as the horror trope of, like, I guess, the final girl, the woman who suffers throughout, usually suffers as well from the supernatural creatures, but also the disbelief and condescension of the men with power. So that stuff's sort of interesting, but it's kind of below the surface, but it's only like a tiny bit below the surface, really.
Yeah, I mean, as a non-cinephile, I obviously have not seen the original Nosferatu, and I have no idea to what extent Eggers has advanced, changed, or modernised the narrative. I don't know if you have. You're probably more likely to have seen it than me.
I haven't actually seen it, which is something I need to confess, an awkwardness. But I'm aware of kind of the famous scenes and things like that. And there are nice moments when Eggers like homages those, like in the way he uses shadows and light and things like that. Like the Count Olaf, when he comes in through a window and like you kind of see him first like reflected in the shadow caught on a flowing drapery, which is, I think, pretty much recreated from the original film. And
yeah, that's in the trailers, isn't it?
Yeah, that's in the trailers, as well. And there's a few other scenes like that, and there's various bits of sort of dream sequences and things are sort of, the colour palette is shifted so far towards blue that they kind of appear black and white almost, very dark blue. And there's also bits that are kind of sepia toned, which creates not only the sense of this being set in the past, but also references the film from the 1930s that's been remade. So I guess I appreciated those things. I guess it just adds more to the fact that this film has a lot to offer the beard scratching cinephile, but not the horror attendee, summed up by the young woman sat behind us,
or the general movie attender such as myself. I mean I saw The Northman, which I think got a bit of a kicking in some reviews for being Eggers making a slightly, I don't know, uninteresting general blockbuster that didn't have as many personal touches. But ultimately, although I do agree that it wasn't as interesting a film as The Lighthouse and The Witch, I think it came closer to succeeding in what it was trying to do than this does, which is why it's above this in my list.
Yeah, no, I really like The Northman. I mean, it was sold very much as a Viking revenge film, and it is a Viking revenge film. And then the weirdness are things to do with, like, you know, the Viking spirituality and the ways they work themselves up into the berserker rage, the drugs and psychology of it all. And again, with William Dafoe as the sort of the Viking priest warlock type character. William Dafoe and Robert Eggers is like a match made in heaven. It's like De Niro and Scorsese, you know, it's one of those great sort of, they work so well together. But yeah, that film, again, like, and that film did, like, you know, unironically had like Valkyries in it and things like that. But also, yeah, again, it was just also a violent blockbuster. Yeah, I feel that was the perfect combination of Eggers' style with mainstream tastes. The problem with this one is that, like, this one is, the way it overlaps in mainstream taste is horror, and this film is just not scary enough.
Yeah, but if your point is that I guess Eggers could be doing something more interesting with his time than making The Northman, then I guess you're right, but, you know, this is up to him what he does with his time.
I guess these are the films that he wants to make, and he should be respected for the fact that he's, you know, working within the system and getting to do the films he wants to do. It's the type of director that Martin Scorsese described as an iconoclast director. People, they work within the system but do it like, right, I make the films on my terms and the films I want to make. And that's harder to be now than it was in the past. So I do respect him for basically working in the system to make these kind of weird movies. I don't know, maybe he'll do something that's lower budget. I mean, these big films like, you know, The Northman and this one, I think, require quite a lot of money that they're difficult to do outside the studio system. Things like The Witch and The Lighthouse, yeah, I agree with you, better films, but they are, you know, kind of two characters pretty much on one set sort of location, things like that. Maybe he'll do something like that next if he wants to. You know, maybe he'll do something big budget and it will really gel together. You know, I feel like he could do an epic historical war movie, might be his sort of thing that could work quite well. I was kind of thinking actually that if he did a film about pirates, I feel that would be an interesting one because, you know, there's so many.
Willem Dafoe do another comedy accent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but also there's so many like kind of popular culture, you know, images and concepts around pirates. That if you did a straight up, this is what pirates are actually like, and what you get from his films is the things you spot, the things from popular culture, you know, that are bled through popular culture that are historically accurate, and then obviously you get the bits that have just been totally erased, you know, from Viking warriors or folk horror or things like that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see that with pirates and things like that, and I'm sure he'd love, you know, to research all the kind of, you know, the history of piracy and what it was actually like. When The Northman came out, I heard a podcast interview of Anya Taylor-Joy, and she said the great thing of working with Robert Eggers is just the way he talks about what you're doing and like with all the details and stuff, and like kind of immerses the actors in the world through all his research and just describes in vivid detail what this character's life would have been like and all the things they're doing and the significance of it. I suppose that's fun for the actors, but if it doesn't translate onto the screen, then it's not fun for the audience.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, for all that I'm being moderately critical of Nosferatu, you know, it's an interesting thing to do. If there are faults in this film, it's not a lack of effort. You know, for all that I've criticised it, I would rather Hollywood was doing stuff like this than producing more identikit shit.
This is better than, you know, Saw 15 or whatever in the horror genres, yeah. It certainly provoked more interesting discussion than some of the Marvel films that might come out this year, especially if those Marvel films are just fine, you know, entertaining.
I mean, it has been, you know, an interesting one for critical response, because I think we've been probably on the negative side towards it, but I've seen plenty of reviews that have absolutely raved about it. You know, it's interesting when you get a big film like this that doesn't necessarily just hit a consensus and stay there.
Yeah, it does divide opinion, which is interesting in and of itself. And yeah, Eggers' films are nothing if not talking points. I mean, pretty much like as soon as I left the cinema, my mind was just full of ideas and thoughts and points about the film, which I pretty much jotted down straight away. And those bullet points I made at first, this is to take you behind the process how the podcast I made, are pretty much what I have just brought to discuss today, because the film itself, my thoughts at the time are just kind of the crucial thing. I didn't need to spend much time sitting there thinking like, so what's this film trying to say? What is interesting about it? What are the points I want to draw out? Because it's just so there, because that's how it works. So it's interesting, I guess, from people who want to make podcasts.
Yeah, as I say, it's not a lack of effort. These are interesting films with a lot going into them. Maybe, as we said earlier, that leads to them trying to do too much sometimes. I don't know. But yeah, I'm in favour of the making of interesting films, even if they don't always 100% work out as masterpieces.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It has been pretty much entirely snubbed by the Oscars. But not even, I think, even anything for cinematography or production design or costuming or things like that.
Not even a technical category. Brutal.
No, exactly. It's a bit harsh. I think the technical stuff is brilliant. It's amazing cost, and the cinematography. I thought, is, phenomenal with the way they've again, like say, made things look black and white and stuff. But anyway, maybe next time, maybe it's just one day I think he'll make some film that will just be like, it'll be one of those things where his style will click with something that's mainstream palatable and it'll be like huge. I'm trying to think of an appropriate example. I guess kind of like the Coen brothers.
Well, Christopher Nolan, when did he become someone who has attention paid to him by the Oscars?
Dunkirk. Maybe.
That's a fair way into his career.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then you're actually totally right. And Oppenheimer is the perfect coming together of Nolan's things he's interested in, his approach to storytelling and filmmaking, combining with a serious, weighty subject and something that's kind of mainstream palatable, and you've just been well made, and obviously showered with Oscars, and a huge commercial hit. Oh yeah, again, Greta Gerwig and Little Women, another example. Finally, this episode, we will be discussing A Real Pain, written by, directed and produced by Jesse Eisenberg, and starring Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin. David and Benji are cousins who are aiming to reconnect after their grandmother's death. They're going on a Jewish history tour of Poland, where she was from, although their very different temperaments clash throughout. We saw this film in the cinema recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, happy to say this was fantastic, I thought. Winning combination of sort of great performances, genuinely funny comedy, this sort of resonant themes and tight characterisation, and also a tight 90-minute length. Yeah, no complaints whatsoever. Really enjoyed this sort of well-pitched comedy drama, which I always enjoy. Good film.
Yes, I love this as well. I thought it was really, really good. It's very simple, but it worked so well. It's pretty much just, the portrait of these two characters and their relationship. And with this, I guess, the third figure of their grandmother in the background. And then there's a few other characters on this tour. But you really get a sense of their complex characters. They've got a big emotional life, and there's things, they've got whole lives outside this film, even though there isn't really much discussed about them. They talk a bit, the Jesse Eisenberg character, David, he's married and he's got a young son and he's got a very boring sort of job, corporate job. You know that Benji's drifting through life, doesn't know what he's doing, going through some emotional problems, kind of not really got a handle on adulting, to use a millennial phrase, but it's kind of subtly done. You really feel they're like complex people, and they've got a complex relationship due to their very different temperaments. Jesse's he's quiet, he's shy, he's a bit awkward, but he's also serious-minded, and Benji's he's all over the shop, he's exuberant, he makes friends easily, but he can be annoying and sometimes just too much, and it's just a really great portrait of what feel like real people.
Yeah, no, it's the way the characters sort of slowly unfurl during the film, which works really well. Yeah, you get this sort of this one side of Benji, and then the other one, it becomes, because Benji's the sort of character who dominates the space he's in, you then get a slightly slower unrolling of the Eisenberg character, David, and what's going on with him. And yeah, both the actors are great. I think Culkin, again, as Benji, has a more sort of showy performance. He's obviously the bigger character, even though it's Eisenberg's writing and directing and starring in the film. Culkin, it probably is more his story, I guess, considering the film both begins and ends with lingering shots of him. So yeah, it's a nice, well-balanced film. It's a good sort of character study. I also quite like the way it sort of, I think, subtly toys with your expectations a bit. There are a lot of times in this film where I felt like it was gesturing at being this sort of more mainstream road trip comedy, but then it sort of pointedly refuses to do a lot of the sort of obvious beats you'd expect. There's a fun bit where they get briefly separated from their tour group due to a comical misunderstanding, and then you sort of think, oh, is this going to be the film now? Are they going to get lost and go on a string of wacky adventures? But spoilers, I guess, they don't. They just do a sort of a brief comedy bit on a train and then get reunited with their tour group. And there's a lot of bits of that where I feel like the film is gesturing at a more obvious direction it could go, but then goes somewhere more thoughtful and delves into, more interesting character points, or eventually the sort of the relationship the two main characters as contemporary Jews have with the Holocaust and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very much this character study. You say it always comes back to the characters rather than say throwing in other characters and stuff. They don't meet people along the way very much, other people to focus on these other people outside this relationship. and things like that. And you can feel the love between them. You can feel the difficulties. I think it's done in the subtleties of the performance. I completely agree with you that Kieran Culkin's performance is like the big one, and it's, you know, captures attention. This film, completely snubbed by the Oscars, apart from Kieran Culkin nominated. I hope he wins. It's a great performance. I mean, Benji's a really one of those leap off the screen kind of characters, in that he has these strong emotional reactions to everything, but it's sort of, there is no logical reason to it, like whether he'll be serious or whether he'll be silly, you know, and he's silly at inappropriate times maybe, and he's serious, you know, at sometimes the wrong moments and things like that. And, you know, he's like a real person. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's not that like he has one thing that triggers him to being angry or upset. It's just he expresses all his feelings and they come out in a sort of illogical way, which I think is like a really, you know, it's a realistic bit of characterization. It's a bold thing, I think, to do from like a acting and a directing point of view, because the audience might be saying, so what's the deal with this character? What are triggering him to behave in this sort of way? And it's not really anything. It's just how he is. He just lives. And that's more realistic. So that's why I think it's like a great performance. And the film is kind of, I feel, Benji seen through David's eyes, which is why maybe Jesse Eisenberg's the main character or the protagonist, and he's got a great subtle performance. I think it's a shame he's not been nominated. I think in the film, other than the very beginning, right at the very end, you never see Benji without David. Well, there's a few times you see David without Benji. I guess it's kind of David's perspective.
Yeah, as you say, there's a nuanced portrayal of the way that David relates to Benji, but, you know, at times there's this sort of social jealousy of his ability to just, you know, go into a room and be the charming main character basically immediately, even when he's dealing with, like, complete strangers. But also obviously aware that he's obviously, you know, struggling and in pain quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, and he deals with other people's difficult emotions well. Like, there's a great scene at the beginning, I think it's a great one for anyone who's a writer or things like that, to really study the scene. When the tour guy first gets together, they kind of set up basically the other characters who aren't the two cousins in the film. And it's done so effectively with a kind of, you know, this is the tour, and the tour guide basically does a kind of awkward icebreaker, talk about yourself bit. Perfect way to introduce the other characters and what their deal is. Efficiently, simply, and without it being heavy-handed. And then one of them is, so they're all Jewish because it's a Jewish history tour. One of them is someone from Rwanda who fled the genocide in Rwanda and lived in Winnipeg in the Jewish community and converted to Judaism. And this guy has quite a heavy story. And Benji, most people's response, and I'm someone who very much connected with David. I feel very much I'm a David in life, and, you know, was just embarrassed and kind of even shocked by how Benji would bring his own emotions and his own response to this guy telling this horrible traumatic story that no one can really relate to. And most, you know, you just think that like respectful silence is the only appropriate thing, but Benji's kind of funny and charming, and it works. You couldn't fake it. He just does it. And you meet people like this in life who can make jokes when someone tells you about the death of their family and have it as like a bonding experience. And I can really, I think you get more of like David's thoughts, in the sense, even though there's no like voiceover or anything like that, but you can kind of see what he's thinking, which is like, I wish I could do that, or like, oh, this is so awkward, but also it's sort of beautiful. But you don't really get, I think, Benji's thoughts. You kind of just get his constant expression of what's going on in his head. But yeah, it's really well done scene. I think one definitely for writers to study.
Yeah, and those other characters in general, as I say, the film is quite short. The film is mostly quite focused on the two cousins, but there are also these other secondary characters in it, and they get a decent amount of texture considering the film isn't long, but there's enough there for them to play their role bouncing off the two leads without ever detracting from them.
Yeah, the film's really good at gesturing at the wider world beyond it. Again, you get very little characterization of these people, mainly just this scene where they introduce themselves, and they don't even say a lot about themselves. Like, two of them just basically talk about where they're from, and just so they're just sort of an old couple. But like, you really get the sense of these people have whole lives and things like that. Like, Michael Mann as a director is known for like creating like huge backstories for his characters, even like minor characters, where they're from, who they are, the sort of people they are, so that like the actors receive these, like, even for small characters, like huge biographies, so they really can understand this person. It wouldn't surprise me if they'd done that for this film because everyone feels so realistic, but also it wouldn't surprise me if they really hadn't, and basically the actors got what's on the page, and the actors were just good at kind of conjuring these people that you believe are real people.
We've talked a lot about a few long films over the years where I've said, usually with a tone of relief, that it felt shorter than it was, but this film almost feels longer than it is because it just packs a lot into its 90 minutes. And, there are scenes where they, again, go to a concentration camp and contemplate the horrors of the Holocaust, and You know, in some ways that's a tricky thing to fit into a tight 90 minutes sort of sometimes comedy, but they somehow make it work and make it not seem like they're breezing over it or being disrespectful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Holocaust scene when they go to the concentration camp is really, really powerfully done. It's almost silent. As a lot of people say, like, there's no words that can live up to such monumental tragedy. The only fitting tribute is silence. That scene is almost silent, and it's, you know, makes you feel what they're feeling, which is like, it's very somber and very reflective. I think it's a great film about the contemporary Jewish experience without shoehorning in, you know, things ripped straight from the headlines, but just because that would make the film like age poorly. But there's this sense of Jewish history these characters have, but they're third generation Americans. You know, they don't seem to really believe in God. They're sort of, I guess, culturally Jewish. They don't really observe many of the rituals, things like that. And they're meeting people who observe, you know, who are more observant and things like that, and quite different. And also they're trying to connect with this like very painful period in history. But also, again, through the medium of the tour guide, he's trying to show them the positive things, you know, like places where Jews had lived and thrived in Poland and things like that. There is a very powerful bit, though, when it goes through all the old businesses, Jewish businesses that used to be in the town, and now the shots are just modern apartment blocks, alleyways, parking lots. It's like, yeah, they were here and they were all swept away at one point. But yeah, it's a good film on that.
Yeah, and again, it's not preachy at all. It's just touching on this stuff and making you think about it. Like, it could try and pathologise the Benji character a bit more and say, oh, he's bipolar or whatever, but it doesn't actually do that.
Or he doesn't have a particular type of Jewish angst. There are quite a lot of, you know, Jewish films exploring Jewish identity when they go into that, you know, is it something in the Jewish experience that's made someone this way, made them, you know, neurotic, fearful, things like that. But it's not a film, his character, it's not his Jewishness that's made him who he is, but it is part of his background.
Well, yeah, it feels very specific, again, as a character study about these characters.
Exactly, yeah. And I like the fact that there's like kind of no real conclusion or things like that. I guess maybe some spoilers and stuff. It's not really a plot heavy film, and I'm not going to talk in specifics about what happens at the end, but there isn't this big sense of like people changing or, you know, having like, you know, really getting to the heart or something, or like a kind of very Hollywood kind of people learn something and then, you know, and then overcome obstacles and succeed in the end, and like, you know, again, which is again more realistic, more like real life, in that it's just you get a slice of these characters, you know, their relationship, and that's it. And it's sort of cyclical. They kind of go around this sense of probably like, you know, connecting, falling out over and over. And that's reinforced by the fact that the film has a kind of identical opening and closing shot. This is a cycle. This is a discrete piece of life, not a huge moment of change, which again, that's what real life is more like. Less than Hollywood, which, you know, has this kind of need for narrative progression.
Well, yeah, if anything, there's a vague opportunity offered for them to break the cycle and change in what would be quite a Hollywood way, but it just sort of doesn't happen, and then it just sort of, as you say, goes back to where it started, and then has the final shot, which I've seen a lot of praise for, and deservedly so, because it's both quite low-key and in some ways just very sad.
It's full of meaning.
Yeah, it's one of these things where, I mean, I haven't gone back and seen the film because I don't love criticism enough to pay a tenner just to verify one basic point. But I don't know how similar the first shot is to the closing shot, because the closing shot carries a lot more meaning because of what you've just sat through. And I don't know whether his performance is identical in the two shots or not.
Yeah. That'd be interesting. I'm sure someone's going to put that on Film Blue Sky or whatever. That'd be an interesting one to do. But yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, there's so many great little scenes that we could discuss in detail. I don't want to go through all of them because, you know, save something for the people who haven't seen the film. But I did really like the bit towards the end when they visit their grandmother's home and they try to leave a rock in tribute to her, and then they have a sort of slightly awkward encounter with the Polish guy who lives in the flat opposite. And again, I felt that just really captured a sort of realistic interaction that they had. The dialogue felt very natural, but also it highlighted the point that, like, despite the horrors of the Holocaust, that this woman lived here and had to flee the Holocaust, that kind of life goes on, and like the people who live in the apartment blocks now, they don't know this woman because life has moved on, and that's the kind of warm thing about life, that it's always going on and new things are happening. And that was kind of subtle but sweet and quite profound moments. So again, there's a real deftness to the writing and performances here.
Yeah, and I thought again that was another moment where they were sort of gesturing at various Hollywood moments you could have had, like them leaving stones there was a bit of a sort of nice Hollywood moment, and again the neighbour appearing, you could have had the neighbour go, oh yes, I knew that woman, or something, but neither of those things happened, so they just had this sort of slightly more realistic, awkward trail off to it, which, as a bit of sort of reversal of expectations comedy, I quite appreciated.
Yeah, you're definitely right. It kind of, you think it's going to go in this traditional way, and it doesn't. Yeah, I thought maybe, are they going to go into this guy's flat and he's going to have like pictures of her when she was young and they're going to have like a bonding moment over discovering something new about their grandmother or something like that. Maybe she had a cousin with a similar relationship to theirs. I mean, that would just be all so neat in Hollywood. But yeah, as you say, like you think it's going to do that, but then it doesn't, and it goes in a more realistic direction of they have a bit of an interaction as the wider world is gestured at. The film moves on to the next bit, yeah.
This has been said in other reviews. I watched Mark Commode's review and he made this exact observation, so I'm well aware I'm not being a clever boy here. But yeah, the title, A Real Pain, I think, when you see it in the trailers, which I think present the film as a bit more of a buddy travel comedy, the title, A Real Pain, is presented in a sort of, oh, he's a real pain way, you know, like a guy and his annoying cousin.
Yeah.
But obviously, you work out fairly quickly within about 20 minutes of the film starting, but the title, A Real Pain, refers to the real pain that Benji is experiencing.
Yeah.
That it does continue in that vein throughout.
Yeah, it kind of perfectly sums up the film. It's not quite what you expect. And this is a good example, to compare it to Nosferatu, where the film is marketed in a very sort of standard Hollywood way, and that, come see this film about these two characters. One of them's a bit ridiculous, and they have to, go through life and things like that. It's very much, it's the odd couple, the apartment, all that sort of thing. But then actually when you get into the film, you get something else, and it's kind of more, emotional and a bit more cerebral maybe, and, still very funny and things like that. So that's how you do it, how you kind of market something as mainstream, but then give the audience something more once you've lured them into the cinema. I mean, it helps that this is Oscar season and it's sold as like, this great performance. You people in the mood right now for films that maybe are doing more and more emotional, but it is hard to sell something that's very cookie cutter Hollywood film, and this is this year's Sideways or whatever, and then give them something else. But this really works. I guess Nosferatu, as discussed, that didn't work out, but I guess fundamentally this is just a really, really good film that I always just loved sitting through. So I think that's kind of, I guess, the core point.
Yeah, but I don't know whether many people came to see this expecting a lol-tastic road trip comedy and were disappointed that it was actually a slightly contemplative character study.
Yeah,
I went to see it entirely because I'd heard it was genuinely good and more than just a road trip comedy, and I don't know whether realistically the entire audience is people who are there for the same reason.
No, exactly, yeah. But there's a lot to enjoy here, and I do feel like this is a big snub from the Oscars.
Yeah, I must admit, I don't want to be too much of a wanker about films I have not seen, but I refuse to believe that the Bob Dylan biopic with Timothée Chalamet is that much better than this.
Well, yeah, the reviews are certainly better for A Real Pain, and I guess watch this space when I will be discussing that film, I'm sure, after I've seen it. I'll certainly post my thoughts to the MFV Blue Sky account. But yeah, I feel this really should definitely, Best Picture nominee, to be honest, yeah. I mean, it's more of an Oscar film than my beloved Dune, or something like that, I suppose.
Yeah, much as I'm sure Alastair is very happy to see Dune on the list, I must admit, this seems more like the sort of thing Oscar likes.
Yeah.
Battle.
But, I don't know, again, highlights the fact the Oscars are not the best films of the year, they're just the most Oscar-y films of the year. But this is great, so go see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Support good filmmaking.
Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much, as ever, for listening. If you have enjoyed this highbrow Oscar chat, then why not go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, and if you go for long enough, you'll probably find more of that somewhere. You could also leave us a nice review on your podcast application of choice. 5 stars, please. Thank you.
You can also get more of us on Blue Sky, where we are at MFV Podcast. Head there to see my thoughts on the various films nominated for Oscars and BAFTAs as I watch them. You can also get more from us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find more from me on Blue Sky, where you can search for Alastair Ball. You can also find me on Instagram. You can find my writing at redtrainblog.com and my theatre reviews at everythingtheatre.com.
And you can find me on Blue Sky as nickbryan.com with an actual dot, or on Instagram as nickbryan.com with the word dot. I'm slowly becoming slightly more consistent, but it's still a bit confusing. And I'm also on the internet at, you guessed it, nickbryan.com with a dot this time. More Kickstarter comics are, I'm sure, inevitable. And another thing that's inevitable is the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, where we will be covering the new Star Trek TV movie streaming thing, Section 31, and the smash hit comic The Power Fantasy by Kieran Gillen and Caspar Wingard. Join us in 2 weeks for that. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right. Okay. Bring the pain.
Bring the pain. I feel that's not the tone the film was aimed at. Sort of vaguely Arnold Schwarzenegger type voice.
No,
Anyway.
I can vaguely imagine Kieran Culkin saying it, but it would probably be sad in some way.